Hey everyone, welcome back to Evil Shadow. Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfy and dive into the darkness. For only 2 years, there was this mysterious pop-up haunted house attraction that would open in October. It was unofficially called Haunted Hill Ho-Si because of a cheap-looking sign, probably bought from Party City, that was propped up in front of the grassy parking area. The so-called parking lot wasn't even paved. It was just a patch of uneven grass designated for visitors' cars. This was the final year the attraction would be open, and it also happened to be the year my friends and I decided to check it out. I went with Matt, Michael, and Eddie. Being college students, we chose a Thursday night to avoid the weekend crowd since none of us had classes on Fridays. As we pulled into the dimly lit lot, the eerie setting immediately set the tone. A chilly wind howled through the trees, and the only light came from a few scattered floodlights illuminating the path to the ticket booth. It was surprisingly quiet, too quiet, actually. We were surprised to find no line at the ticket stand. After purchasing our tickets, we followed the path leading to the entrance. There, we saw only a handful of people waiting, a grand total of 4 ahead of us. The faint sound of muffled screams echoed from somewhere inside, and my stomach twisted with a mix of excitement and dread. What we didn't realize, however, was that this haunted house had a unique twist. They only allowed one person in at a time. This wasn't mentioned anywhere on the website or signage, so it took us all by surprise. If anything, this made the experience feel even more sinister. Splitting us up was a stroke of genius for whoever planned this. Naturally, we shoved Michael to go first. He protested, but relented after we teased him enough. I was second to last, just before Eddie. Every couple of minutes, a woman dressed in a bloody costume would open the door, signaling the next person to enter. As the line grew shorter, my nerves started to build. By the time Matt disappeared into the dark entrance ahead of me, my heart was pounding in my chest. Finally, it was my turn. The woman in the bloody costume didn't break character as she opened the door, giving me a sinister smile before motioning for me to step inside. The heavy door creaked shut behind me, and I was immediately enveloped in darkness, save for the flickering, erratic glow of small strobe lights scattered throughout the building. The atmosphere was oppressive. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like blood. I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. All around me were gruesome props, mutilated bodies, severed limbs, and grotesque masks. I could hear faint whispers and footsteps, but it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. As I cautiously moved through the narrow hallways, actors dressed in horrifying costumes would leap out from hidden corners or holes in the walls. Each time, I jumped and let out a startled gasp, my nerves fraying more with every scare. Even though I knew it was all staged, it felt disturbingly real. Then came a hallway. It was a long, dark corridor separating 2 rooms, and the absence of any light made it impossible to see more than a few inches in front of me. Suddenly, I felt something brush against my back. My breath hitched, and I spun around, letting out a short scream. In the flickering light, I could make out the silhouette of a tall figure towering over me. Relieved, I laughed nervously, assuming it was just another actor. "Good one," I muttered, trying to shake off the tension, but the figure didn't react the way I expected. Instead of retreating or trying to scare me further, the actor began pushing me down the hallway. I stumbled forward, completely taken off guard. I laughed again, this time more uncertainly. All right, I'm going," I said, assuming this was part of the attraction. But as the moments passed, my unease began to grow. The darkness seemed to stretch forever, and I could no longer hear the sound of other guests, or anything else for that matter. The actor didn't speak or break character. They just kept guiding me further into the void. Their grip was firm but not painful, and I tried to convince myself this was just an elaborate way to heighten the fear. But something about the silence felt wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure stopped abruptly. I heard the creak of a door opening, followed by the sound of it slamming shut behind me. The air changed. It felt colder, heavier. The silence was absolute, broken only by the pounding of my own heartbeat. I stood frozen in place, my mind racing. This didn't feel like part of the haunted house anymore. Something was very, very wrong. I still thought this was part of the act, though my nerves were definitely on edge. The darkness was impenetrable, and the silence wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. Then, out of nowhere, I felt hands grabbing me, not in the playful, spooky way you'd expect in a haunted house, but in a way that sent a chill straight down my spine. The grip was firm, invasive, and far too aggressive for what should have been a safe attraction. Panic surged through me, and I instinctively shoved the person off. "Get the hell off me, dude," I snapped, my voice echoing eerily in the pitch black space. I stood there in silence, my heart hammering in my chest, expecting some kind of response. "You're going too far, man," I said, still trying to convince myself this was just part of the act. "You can't touch people like that." But nothing happened. No eerie laughter, no spooky sound effects, not even the faintest shuffle of footsteps. Just silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every breath you take. Enough time passed for my gut instinct to kick in. This wasn't right. Something was off. Despite the strict rules they'd given us about not using our phones during the attraction, I couldn't ignore the growing dread. I pulled out my phone, ignoring the trembling in my hands, and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the room I was in, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was no longer in part of the haunted house meant for guests. I stood in what appeared to be a storage room filled with miscellaneous props, cleaning supplies, and tools. But none of that was what grabbed my attention first. The first thing I noticed was him, a tall man standing just 3 or 4 feet away, watching me. He wasn't wearing a costume like the other actors, and his presence immediately screamed wrong. He wore plain black clothing, and a black face mask covered the lower half of his face. There was nothing theatrical or playful about him. "What are you doing, dude?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. Instead, he began making strange, exaggerated motions with his arms, as if he were mimicking some sort of character or performance. But it wasn't convincing. It was unsettling. My skin crawled as I realized this wasn't someone trying to scare me for fun. I kept my flashlight trained on him as I backed toward the door, my heart racing. "Stay back," I warned, but he didn't move closer, just stood there, his movements robotic and unnatural. Finally, my hand found the doorknob, and I yanked the door open. I bolted out of the room, using my phone's flashlight to navigate back through the dark hallway. My breaths came in quick, shallow gasps, and every shadow seemed to move as I hurried along. Eventually, I came across another actor, who immediately snapped at me to turn off my flashlight. I was violated. I practically shouted, my voice trembling. Someone grabbed me, and I don't think they work here. The actor, clearly caught off guard, dropped their menacing character voice. They were just a teenager, probably no older than me, and they looked completely clueless about what to do. Just keep walking that way, they stammered, pointing down the hallway. "You're almost to the end. Where's your boss?" I demanded, desperation seeping into my voice. "They're at the ticket stand," the actor said quickly. "The manager's office is there." I didn't wait for more explanation. I speed walked the rest of the haunted house, ignoring the remaining scares and actors trying to stay in character. My only goal was to get out of there. A few minutes later, I finally emerged into the cool night air, my nerves still rattled. My friends, Matt, Michael, and Eddie were waiting for me, looking confused. "Why'd you get out last?" Eddie asked, frowning. I quickly explained what had happened, my voice rising as I recounted the details. My friend's expression shifted from confusion to alarm, and we immediately headed to the ticket stand. There, I demanded to speak to the manager, but the worker at the booth shook her head apologetically. "He's not here tonight," she said. "He'll be back tomorrow." I told her what had happened, my voice shaking with anger and fear. She listened, wide-eyed, and promised to alert the manager as soon as possible. But her vague reassurances did little to calm my racing thoughts. As we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that the tall man in the storage room wasn't part of the attraction at all. And the haunted house's sudden closure after that year, it didn't feel like a coincidence. The worker at the ticket stand handed me back my $30 after I explained everything that had happened. Her apologies felt hollow, but at least I got my money back. I couldn't shake the experience, though. The unsettling feeling that this was more than just a haunted house gone wrong. The very next day, something chilling happened. A girl from our college, someone we all knew, made a Facebook post that stopped me in my tracks. She wrote that she had been sexually assaulted the night before at the same haunted house. The same night we were there. The news spread quickly. Her post gained traction, with people sharing it, commenting their outrage and demanding answers. I reached out to her directly through Facebook, recounting my own experience in the haunted house. As we talked, it became clear that we'd encountered the same person, but what happened to her was far worse. She described how the man had cornered her in a dark room and physically assaulted her before she managed to escape. She pressed charges against the owner of the haunted house, citing negligence for failing to provide adequate security. The staff, of course, denied that the man who assaulted us had any affiliation with the attraction. They insisted he wasn't an employee, just someone who had somehow snuck in. I wanted to believe them, but questions gnawed at me. How could they not have noticed an unauthorized person wandering their halls? How did he manage to get through without anyone stopping him? There were no cameras, no security checkpoints, nothing. The haunted house shut down later that month, and the incident was quietly swept under the rug. But the memory of that night stuck with me, an uncomfortable reminder of how easily things can go from fun to horrifying. That was the last time I ever set foot in a haunted house. Fast forward a few years. I live in Fort Worth, Texas now, and every year there's this massive haunted house attraction that draws in crowds from all over. My friends kept telling me to give it another shot, saying it would be fun. I don't know, I'd say, brushing them off. Haunted houses weren't exactly my idea of a good time anymore. This year, though, they convinced me. "Come on," my friend Noah said. "You can't let one bad experience ruin it forever." For some context, I've had a rough past. My childhood left me with a lot of scars, some of which I'm still working through. PTSD isn't easy to talk about, but it's there, lingering like a shadow. I wasn't sure if a haunted house was the best idea, but part of me wanted to face my fears. Noah hosted a little pregame before we headed out. It was 6 of us, 3 guys including me, and 2 of their girlfriends. We smoked and drank in Noah's backyard, everyone laughing and hyping up the night. I rarely smoke weed because it tends to make me paranoid, but tonight I figured I'd give it another shot. We bought our tickets online while we were hanging out, and by the time the Uber arrived, we were all in good spirits. The alcohol dulled the edge of my usual anxiety, and I felt surprisingly relaxed. The haunted house was about 20 minutes away. When we got there, the line was long, at least half an hour, but the energy was infectious. People were chatting, laughing, and screaming from inside the attraction. We even made small talk with the group in front of us. As we got closer to the entrance, though, I started feeling a little off. The mix of weed and alcohol was hitting me harder than I expected. My head felt light, and my stomach churned uneasily. I didn't want to ruin the night for everyone, so I kept it to myself. When it was finally our turn to go in, the screaming started almost immediately. The actors in the haunted house were relentless, their performances unnervingly good. They were in our faces, shouting, lunging, and making terrifying noises. At first it was fun, but the deeper we went into the maze of horrors, the more I started to unravel. I realized too late that getting high before coming here was a mistake. My heart pounded erratically, my palms were slick with sweat, and the strobe lights and fog were making everything feel surreal and distorted. Every jump scare hit me like a punch to the chest, and I could feel anxiety clawing its way through my mind. One actor must have noticed how scared and quiet I was because he locked onto me, yelling and screeching as he leaned in close. His grotesque makeup and wild gestures sent a wave of panic through me, but I clenched my fists trying to hold it together. My friends were laughing and screaming, clearly enjoying themselves, but I wasn't okay. Time felt warped. The attraction seemed to stretch on endlessly, every twist and turn another assault on my senses. My breaths were shallow, and my head spun as we entered a room bathed in an ominous red glow. In the center stood an actor dressed as a bloodied man in a suit and top hat, delivering a chilling monologue as part of the act. But my eyes weren't on him. In the corner of the room, barely illuminated by the red light, was a figure. He wasn't in costume, and he wasn't part of the scene. He just stood there, staring at me. As my eyes adjusted, the room seemed to close in around me. The figure's face came into focus. My breath caught in my throat, and an icy dread coursed through my veins. It was my father. A scream tore its way out of me, raw and primal, silencing the room. My friends turned to me, laughing nervously at first, thinking I was playing along with a haunted house vibe. But when they saw the terror etched on my face, their smiles vanished. "What's wrong?" one of the girls asked, grabbing my arm. "It's my dad," I choked out, pointing to the corner. All eyes turned to where I was pointing, but the figure was gone. "There's no one there," one of my friends said, their voice uneasy. The actor broke character and stepped closer. "Is he okay?" he asked, his tone concerned. But I wasn't okay. My heart raced, my chest heaved, and I felt the walls closing in. Panic surged through me as I shouted, "I need to leave. I want to get out." Noah grabbed my arm and guided me to a side exit. The cool night air hit my face like a slap, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. We sat on a bench outside, and I buried my face in my hands, trying to catch my breath. "You shouldn't have smoked so much," Noah said gently, his voice steady and reassuring. "It's just the weed messing with your head. Your dad isn't here." But the image of my father's face lingered. It wasn't just paranoia. It wasn't a random hallucination. It was him, his eyes, his expression, everything. My father was a ghost from my past, one I tried to bury. He had abused my siblings and me for years before leaving us and my mom when I was 10. I was the oldest, and I remembered everything. The trauma hadn't gone away. It had just been lying dormant, waiting for a moment like this to resurface. When our friends finished the haunted house, they found us at a nearby Wendy's. I sat there, picking at my food, trying to ground myself. No one judged me or made jokes at my expense, at least not to my face, and I was grateful for that. But I couldn't shake the embarrassment, the feeling that I'd ruined the night. I went home earlier than I planned, lying awake in bed, replaying the moment in the red room over and over. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me, or was it something more? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't setting foot in another haunted house again. When I got home that night, I crashed hard. The mix of alcohol and weed, combined with the emotional turmoil, left me utterly drained. But sleep didn't bring the relief I hoped for. My dreams were a jumbled mess, replaying the scene in the haunted house over and over. The red glow, the eerie silence, and my father's piercing stare haunted me. He wasn't just standing in the corner anymore. In my dream, he was moving closer, his voice low and menacing. "Wake up, Charlie," he said, his voice sharp and cold. The words jolted me awake, but waking up didn't bring comfort. I opened my eyes to the suffocating darkness of my bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought I was alone, but then I saw it. Towering over my bed was my father, or at least something that looked like him. His frame was impossibly tall, his features distorted in ways that defied logic. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and his body twisted in ways no human should be able to move. It took a few seconds for my brain to process what I was seeing. My breath caught in my throat, and fear rooted me in place. Then, like a primal instinct kicking in, I screamed a raw, guttural scream that ripped through the silence of the night. The door to my room burst open, and my mom came rushing in, flipping on the light. The apparition was gone. The room was empty, but the fear remained. I was shaking, tears streaming down my face as I cried out. I saw Dad. My mom, clearly startled, held me and tried to calm me down. But how could I explain what I had just seen? It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It felt real, too real. That night left a scar on my mind. It wasn't just the haunted house or the substances I'd consumed. It was the shadow of my past that had come back to haunt me in the most literal way. Since that night, I haven't touched weed, and my drinking is limited to the occasional light cocktail. Haunted house attractions? Never again. I was left alone there, in the middle of nowhere, tied to a pole in the dim light of the corn maze. My heart raced as I heard faint laughter and screams in the distance from the other sections of the haunted house. I could feel the weight of isolation pressing down on me, but I tried to push the anxiety aside. I had to perform. This was my job now. A few minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. The first group of guests was finally coming. I braced myself, taking a deep breath and putting on the best performance I could. I screamed, my voice cracking as I yelled for help, pretending that some unseen terror was about to return. "Help me, he's coming back soon," I cried out, shaking my wrists as if struggling to break free. Some guests played along, offering a quick word of encouragement or pretending to try to untie me. It wasn't as bad as I'd feared, but there was still something strange in the air that made it hard to fully relax. Then came the two men. They didn't speak much when they first passed, just eyeing me silently. I thought they were part of the usual crowd, but something about their gaze sent a shiver down my spine. The way their eyes locked onto me, intense and unblinking, made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't expected. As they walked further into the maze, I tried to shake off the discomfort. I had a job to do after all. But then they came back, and this time they were walking off the path. I turned around, about to call out for them to get back on track, but before I could speak, one of them laughed under his mask. The sound sent a chill through me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. They spoke in a language I didn't recognize. Russian, maybe? My heart skipped a beat. One of the men walked further into the maze, disappearing into the shadows, while the other approached me. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively pulled against the ropes, trying to get free, but I was still tied to the pole. I opened my mouth to scream, to call for help, but before I could, his hands were on me, grabbing inappropriately. I froze for a split second, realizing what was happening. I screamed, my voice hoarse with fear. This isn't part of the act. Help! Panic surged through me. I struggled against the ropes, desperate to break free. Just then, one of the supervisors appeared, rushing toward me. The two men bolted, running off into the maze. I was untied quickly, but the terror still gripped me as I was escorted away from the scene. I could hear the supervisor's voice, asking if I was okay, but I could barely comprehend the words through the fog of fear. I was still shaken, my mind reeling. The adrenaline was pumping, and I was on autopilot as I left the maze. Outside, I immediately called my parents. My hands were shaking as I told them what had happened, and they insisted I leave right away. I didn't need to be told twice. The drive home should have been a relief, but my nerves were on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, making sure I wasn't being followed. My heart jumped when I spotted a white car in my rearview mirror, staying a few cars behind me, no matter how many turns I made. It was too deliberate to be a coincidence. I tried to stay calm and think clearly. I needed to get to a police station. I quickly typed police station into my phone and drove toward it. The white car continued to follow, its headlights looming behind me. Every turn I made, it made two. The anxiety in my chest was suffocating. When I finally reached the parking lot of the police precinct, I pulled in quickly, glancing behind me. The white car didn't follow. It just kept going, disappearing down the street. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes, trying to steady my breath before I drove home. Even then, I checked my mirrors constantly, never quite able to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I never went back to that haunted house. The fear still lingered, and the memory of that night would stay with me for a long time. The air was thick with the eerie ambience of the corn maze. The haunting sound loops echoed through the crops, the distorted voices and shrill screams from the speakers adding to the chilling atmosphere. As I stood there, tied to the wooden pole, I could hear the distant noises of the attraction opening, signaling the start of the night. A sharp air horn sounded off in the distance, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. Although I was excited for the experience, I couldn't shake off the nervousness. I was alone in the middle of the corn maze, and the first group of guests wouldn't pass by for a few minutes. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on getting into character. As the first guests passed, I began to scream and cry out, begging for help, yelling, "He's coming back soon." It was all just part of the act, but as I screamed, I couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable. Some guests played along, but others simply ignored me, continuing down the path. Eventually, the maze grew quiet again, and I began to notice the long gaps between groups of guests. I heard rustling in the crops nearby and wondered if it was a staff member checking on me, but there was no one in sight. The silence was unsettling, and I began to feel the weight of isolation. That's when I saw them. Two men, the same ones who had passed by earlier. They were walking toward me, but this time, something felt off. I broke character and called out, "You can't stray off the path." One of them chuckled under his mask, and the two began speaking in a language I didn't understand. Russian, maybe? My heart started to race, and a feeling of dread washed over me. I tried to keep my composure as one of the men walked off the path, standing still in the shadows, keeping a watchful eye. The other man approached me, too close for comfort. Before I could react, his hands were on me, inappropriately grabbing at me. My blood ran cold. I screamed, my voice hoarse with terror. "This isn't part of the act. Help, I'm being assaulted." The fear and shock hit me like a tidal wave. Moments later, one of the supervisors appeared, rushing into the scene to see if I was okay. The two men had already fled, disappearing into the maze. My heart was still pounding in my chest as I was quickly untied and escorted out of the maze. I barely registered anything as I fumbled for my phone, dialing my parents in a panic. They insisted I leave immediately, and I didn't hesitate. The drive home should have been a relief, but my anxiety only grew. I kept glancing into my rearview mirror, noticing a white car following me. It stayed behind me through every turn, no matter how many random streets I took. My skin tingled with the realization that I was being followed. My pulse quickened as I frantically searched for a safe place to go. I dialed the nearest police precinct into my phone and drove toward it, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The white car followed me the entire way. When I pulled into the parking lot of the precinct, I watched as the car kept driving, disappearing into the night. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, shaking with fear. I finally turned the engine back on and drove home, checking my mirrors every few seconds to make sure I wasn't being followed anymore. By the time I got home, I was a wreck. I never went back to that haunted house. The night had been a nightmare, and the fear lingered in my mind long after the attraction had closed for good. I couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker than just a haunted house had been lurking that night.